Back in the 90s, there were a handful of comedic actors who became cultural icons and staples of an entire generation. They starred in movies, sitcoms, and even voice acted in the biggest animated films. Some, even for whatever reason, having animated series based on movies that they starred in, like Jim Carrey in The Mask or Ace Ventura. Well, if you're willing to make an animated kids show, you know what's next, right? For a reason I'll never understand, there were many video games based on IPs that relied heavily on the comedic actors who starred in them, almost all of which featured realistic pixel art as opposed to something more cartoony. It's very strange. Let's take a look at some of them.
First up is the entire reason I wanted to make this video in the first place. For anyone not aware, Tim Allen, probably most notable for being the Santa Claus and the voice of Buzz Lightyear, starred in a sitcom in the 90s called Home Improvement. It was very popular, and the entire premise basically revolved around this.
You emitted a seemingly endless lexicon of grunts. Those grunts are at least as expressive as speech. I wondered if you would give us a lesson in grunting. What sort of grunt expresses surprise?
Oh.
Sympathy.
Oh.
Confusion.
Well, for whatever reason, someone decided this was the perfect candidate for a video game. 2.5 decades later, and I still don't understand who this was for. So the premise of the game here is Tim is hosting his TV show Tool Time, a popular cable show centered around home improvement, hardware, and working with tools in general. Tim announces that the show's sponsor, Binford, is coming out with a new line of souped-up power tools with Tim's name on them. Unfortunately, just as Tim is about to show them off, he finds out the tools have gone missing, so now he's off to another set that's inside the studio to look for them. Each set is filming a different show or movie, which surprisingly actually contextualizes and makes sense to the varying level settings, but that's about the only thing in this game I'm willing to bow my hat to. The game is a platformer, and it's got some of the most janky movement and combat I've seen in a while. Spoiler alert for a lot of the games I'm going to talk about in this video, but I could not and was not willing to make it past the first stage. The object, instead of your typical go from left to right and make it to the end, is to explore the stage to find a specific number of collectible crates. Doing so is easier said than done, though, because you'll be fighting with the controls every step of the way, and it's next to impossible to evade enemies on a first playthrough because the camera doesn't allow you to see far enough to act quickly, leading to a lot of really cheap deaths. This game is just straight up bad, and it's not even like remarkably bad to the point where there's a million things to make fun of either. There's this. In 1994, a live-action adaptation of the Flintstones came out starring, most notably, John Goodman, Rick Moranis, and Rosie O'Donnell. Then they made a video game. So if you ever wanted to play a platformer starring a constantly out-of-breath John Goodman as Fred Flintstone, have I got some good news for you. The animation in this game is surprisingly well done, I'll give it that, but all things considered, it's actually a bit off-putting, because it's kind of reaching like Uncanny Valley level for pixel art, and then it's animated like a cartoon character. I wandered around the beginning of the stage for like 10 minutes wondering how to progress until I finally looked up a playthrough and it showed me that I could climb and hang on to ledges, so I was already off to a bit of an annoying start. So Fred has 3 basic attacks. He can swing his club, throw a rock, or roll a bowling ball at enemies. As you might expect, the latter 2 are limited and require ammo. Luckily though, you do have the option to recollect ammo after you've thrown it, which is pretty convenient. As far as I can tell, you pretty much just defend yourself from frogs and these Joe and Mac looking cavemen. I'm gonna assume there probably has to be a few more enemy types, but I didn't play far enough to find out. Despite the obvious work that went into sprite animation, this is yet another low-budget platformer with cheap enemy placement, and if you've watched anything I've done in the past, you probably won't be surprised to hear that we won't be exploring past the first stage. Here's a game starring the late, great Robin Williams, though I do have to say, this one might not be his proudest moment. Apparently mine either, because while most of these games I at least try to conquer the first stage, this one I couldn't even figure out what to do. So this game is based on the Robin Williams film Toys, where a son is supposed to inherit his father's toy business. The business is then given to a mean old army man, and havoc ensues. You don't have to stipulate if you've seen the movie. I know it's a very super dumbed down, simplified version of the plot, but it's just not important for the video. Anyway, whatever this game is supposed to be, I sure can't handle it. Before starting the stage, it's explained to you that you're supposed to take out a specific number of security cameras and use different toys as your means of defense or tools. All in all, I found exactly 1 camera that I couldn't even approach without getting my head blown off. I don't know who animated this sprite, but I highly doubt he was given instructions to make the player character look like he crapped his pants. Literally the only thing I was able to figure out how to do was take out some enemies. enemies. I'm assuming certain weapons work against certain enemies, but I tried pretty much everything on these tanks guarding the security camera to no avail. I even tried just strong-arming my way through them and taking out the camera straight up, and that didn't work either. I'm well aware that I obviously have no idea what I'm doing, but the game clearly didn't do a good enough job explaining to me what my objective even was. So now we've come to the Mike Myers portion of the video, and oddly enough, he's had way too many video game appearances and I'm not even covering them all. So Wayne's World is probably one of my favorite movies of all time, and has been since I was pretty young, and now I'm very glad I never knew about or asked for the SNES game based on it. For anyone unaware, in the movie, Wayne, who's played by Mike Myers, has a public access show with his best friend and co-host, Garth, played by Dana Carvey. The game starts off with a cutscene of an episode of Wayne's show and follows the beats of the show.
Uh-oh.
The story of the game is stupid and unimportant. Wayne's telling some story, something about Garth getting kidnapped inside a video game. Who cares? They only shoehorned a plot in so this could exist as a video game. The point is, now we're in a video game for some reason, and oh dear. And I immediately have no idea what I'm supposed to be doing. I get that it's a platformer, you get power-ups that buff your guitar laser, and you have to run around defeating enemies while some of the most repetitive music I've ever heard in a game plays, but I traversed this stage multiple times, and no matter how hard I tried, I could not figure out what to do or where to go, and it doesn't help that all the stage assets look identical. I realize at this point I must sound like a broken record, but you gotta understand, these games suck bad. Eventually I got a game over, and once again I couldn't even make it past the first stage. But this game does have continues. But do I want to continue? So there's also a Wayne's World game for the NES, and I think this one might be worse. At least with the SNES game, it's blatantly obvious what it is. If not for the cutscenes, I'd have absolutely no idea this was supposed to be a Wayne's World game. So in this one, you can play as both Wayne and Garth. Well, not really can, more like have to. Wayne's basic attack is a karate kick straight out of Kung Fu, and Garth just has a magnum. You pretty much just walk in a straight line attacking enemies. Most take a lot of hits, but funny enough, this game is so poorly coded that these ninja enemies end up just despawning in the middle of attacking them half the time. Also, there's fall damage. Why is there fall damage? Was this Donkey Kong 1? Especially in a game that doesn't reward you for traversing its upper platforms, but encourages it by throwing in these drums which act as springs. I don't get it. And the premise of the game doesn't make any sense either. Like when you first start the game, a cutscene plays and just quotes the actual movie script verbatim, and then out of nowhere, you're just in a level. And then once you beat it, Wayne just makes some comment about how he's small all of a sudden and looks like a video game character, and then promptly just drops it to continue the script. I also find it amusing that they fully recreated Garth's hair in pixel art, but then just kind of drew a trash bag over Wayne's head. I don't get why this game was made. Now, I'm going to take a little artistic liberty with a few games going forward and say that despite them not actually coming out in the 90s, most of the very early 2000s was super derivative of the 90s, and I think some things still qualify, especially since these actors really blew up in the 90s to begin with. Like, yeah, Iron Maiden's still around, but come on, they're an 80s band. Anyway, while researching this video, I was surprised to find that there were 2 games based on the Austin Powers series on the Game Boy Color. Why? What I expected were 2 mediocre Game Boy platformers along the same lines of the other games I've played so far. What I wasn't expecting were 2 of the most phoned-in minigame collections I've ever seen. And that's being generous, but we'll get to that shortly. What I really wasn't expecting were for both games to literally be the exact same game. I'm not kidding. They're essentially identical. One is from the perspective of Austin Powers, and the other is from the perspective of Dr. Evil. The only difference between them gameplay-wise is that one has what is supposed to be a platforming minigame, and the other is that stupid motorcycle game that I'm sure you've seen in 50,000 other places. This might just be the worst game of the bunch. The entire game is either derivative or just flat out a ripoff. The platforming portion is probably the only thing I can say is its own thing. The rest of the game consists of that bike game, which is a copy, this maze game, literally just Pac-Man, rock, paper, scissors, literally just rock, paper, scissors, and straight up Othello, like the board game.
That's what the kids are into. I know when I was younger, we used to get the boys together, snuck a few brewskis out to the shed, and played Othello till our fingers bled.
I genuinely don't understand who these games were for, what their purpose is, why do they exist. I like most things starring Jim Carrey, and apparently that extends to video games. The Mask is an SNES game based on the 1994 movie of the same name, and it's like surprisingly really good. Another game with great animation. This game looks great and very, very surprisingly controls pretty well. What a breath of fresh air. They actually translated the character perfectly into his movement. It's hard to explain if you haven't seen the movie, but the Mask as a character is very animated. They kept this in mind not only when creating his sprite animations, but the movement itself and how it feels. This is a video game based on a live-action movie that feels like a cartoon. You can probably tell just by the footage right now exactly what I'm talking about. The game is sort of a platformer mixed with some exploration as well as combat. I will admit though, it's pretty hard, and I didn't make it very far. Only a couple stages in, but not due to giving up. The game's bosses are a little cheap, and I unfortunately got a game over. And this is another game that happens to lack continues, so once you get a game over, that's all she wrote. This game is actually really good, and besides that one blemish, I can definitely see myself actually trying to play this to completion. Probably the biggest surprise to me, and the second game that made me want to find more games like this, was the fact that while walking the floor of the Portland Retro Gaming Expo recently, I stumbled upon a game based on Adam Sandler's Little Nicky. I don't think I've ever been more intrigued and confused at a game's existence. While I always wanted to cover the home improvement game, this is the one that made me go, wait, how many of these are there? And well, here we are. Little Nicky for the Game Boy Color is, to no surprise, a platformer. Even less surprising is that it's also not a very good one. Shocker. They did put a little effort into some character animations though, so that's commendable. The game, as expected, follows the plot of the movie. Nicky, one of the Devil's 3 sons, has to go to Earth to track down his 2 brothers and bring them back home to save his dad from dying.
Get in the flask!
When Nicky stands over an open flame, it charges a power boost that lets him run faster and jump farther, and it's needed to platform over certain gaps. It doesn't control terribly, but it is difficult sometimes to tell where platforms begin and end. I didn't get very far, but I did the tutorial and got a couple stages in, and while the first stage I was pretty much able to just hold right and tap jump to reach the end of the stage with the help of the fire power-up, the second stage proved more difficult, but less so due to difficulty and more so due to my impatience. At first, I didn't understand why I kept getting hit by a train until I realized that the pits that I thought were instant deaths were actually supposed to be used to duck into to avoid getting obliterated. I learned too late though, and I had a limited number of lives left. I got a game over, and unfortunately once you do, you have to restart the game all the way over from the beginning, which includes the 4-minute long intro cutscene as well as the entire tutorial level. Which, by the way, if you've seen the movie, having a limited number of lives actually completely goes against the plot. I've got to say, while the prospect of experiencing a whole Adam Sandler platforming adventure seems enticing, I don't have that kind of time. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you liked it and want to see more, well, there's a couple other videos you can check out right there, right on the screen. And if you want to keep up with everything I release, subscribe and then tap the bell icon. And I also have a Patreon right there if you want to help support the channel.